I never thought abandonment would sound like boarding announcements echoing through Terminal C while my own family disappeared into the crowd without a backward glance. My name is Grace Smith. I'm 19 years old, and on what was supposed to be our dream vacation to celebrate my high school graduation, I discovered that the people I trusted most in this world were capable of something so cold, so calculated, that it would shatter everything I believed about love, loyalty, and what family actually means. But here's the thing that nobody, not my parents, not my older brother, not even I, saw coming. Sometimes the universe has a way of turning your worst moment into the doorway to your destiny. Because while my family was boarding Flight 447 to Cancun without me, convinced they'd taught me some twisted lesson about responsibility, the President of the United States was making an emergency landing at Denver International Airport. And somehow, in ways I'm still trying to understand, those two events were about to collide in the most impossible, life-changing way imaginable. Have you ever been so completely betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you that you felt like the ground beneath your feet had simply vanished? Have you ever stood in a crowded place feeling more alone than you've ever felt in your entire life, wondering how the people who raised you could look you in the eye and lie so effortlessly? Because that's exactly where the story begins. Not with triumph, not with some fairy tale moment, but with me standing in the middle of Denver International Airport, clutching a boarding pass for a flight I'd never be allowed to take, watching my family walk away as if I were nothing more than a stranger who'd asked them for directions. But stick with me, because what happened next defies every assumption I'd ever made about how the world works, about justice, about second chances, and about what happens when you refuse to let other people's cruelty define your worth. This story doesn't end with abandonment in that airport terminal. That's where it explodes into something I never could have imagined. A sequence of events so extraordinary that I'm still processing it months later. You see, my family thought they were teaching me a lesson. They thought leaving me behind would somehow prove their point about my attitude problem, my unwillingness to conform to their rigid expectations, my constant questions about why we had to present this perfect image to the world while treating each other like adversaries behind closed doors. They were so convinced of their own righteousness, so certain that a few hours of panic and fear would break me down and make me more compliant, more willing to play their games. They had no idea that I'd been carrying a secret, something I discovered about our family's history, about my grandfather's service, about connections that ran deeper than any of us understood. Something that would turn their cruel manipulation into the catalyst for the most incredible 24 hours of my life. Something that would bring Air Force One to a standstill and put me face to face with people who understood the difference between real strength and the petty power games my family had been playing my entire life. I'm telling you this story because I want you to know that sometimes, when everything falls apart, when the people you love show you exactly who they really are, when you're standing alone in what feels like the wreckage of your entire world, sometimes that's not the end. Sometimes that's the moment when your real life finally begins. Sometimes the worst betrayal opens the door to the greatest adventure you never knew you were meant to have. My family left me at that airport thinking they'd won, thinking they'd finally put me in my place, thinking they'd proven that their version of love, conditional, controlling, manipulative, was the only version I'd ever get. They had no idea that within 3 hours, I'd be sitting in the Oval Office. They couldn't have predicted that their daughter, the one they'd written off as a disappointment, would end up in a conversation that would change not just my future, but the future of thousands of other young women facing impossible choices. And they definitely never imagined that their act of abandonment would lead to me being offered opportunities they'd spent their entire lives dreaming about. Opportunities that came not because of who my family was, but because of who I chose to be when I thought nobody was watching.
So let me ask you this. What would you do if the worst day of your life suddenly became the first day of the rest of your life? What would you do if the people who hurt you the most accidentally opened the door to everything you'd ever wanted but never dared to hope for? Because that's exactly what happened to me in Denver International Airport on a Tuesday afternoon in June, when my family's cruelty collided with destiny in ways none of us saw coming. This is the story of how I went from being abandoned by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally to being personally welcomed aboard Air Force One by the president herself. This is the story of how betrayal became transformation, how isolation became opportunity, and how the worst moment of my young life became the launching pad for adventures I'm still living every single day. Are you ready? Because what happened next changed everything. Let me back up and tell you who I really am, because understanding that is crucial to understanding why what happened next was so impossible, so completely outside the realm of anything I thought my life could become.
Grace Smith, 19 years old, recent graduate of Willowbrook High School in suburban Phoenix, Arizona. On paper, I probably looked like any other middle-class American teenager. My dad, Robert Smith, worked as a regional manager for a medical supply company. My mom, Linda, taught third grade at the local elementary school. My older brother, Tyler, was starting his junior year at Arizona State, majoring in business because that's what Dad told him would guarantee stability. We lived in a beige house on Maple Street, in a neighborhood where every lawn was exactly the same shade of green and every family drove exactly 2 cars, one practical sedan and one slightly less practical SUV for weekend adventures we rarely took. From the outside, we were the definition of normal. Boring, even. But here's what that surface-level normalcy was hiding. I was drowning. Not literally, of course, but in every way that mattered. I was drowning in expectations I could never meet, drowning in a family dynamic that felt like walking through quicksand every single day, drowning in the gap between who I was and who everyone around me seemed determined to make me become. See, I wasn't like Tyler. I didn't have a clear, linear path that made sense to adults. I didn't want to major in business or marketing or any of the practical fields my parents kept pushing. I was fascinated by international relations, by global politics, by the way decisions made in Washington, D.C. rippled out to affect real people in real ways around the world. I spent my free time reading about diplomatic strategies and foreign policy, instead of shopping at the mall or obsessing over which college boys might notice me. My parents called it a phase. They were convinced that if they just applied enough pressure, enough gentle guidance, I'd eventually snap out of it and choose something more realistic for a girl from Phoenix whose family had never produced anyone more notable than a high school principal and a small-town bank manager. The pressure had been building for months. Every conversation became a battlefield. Every dinner table discussion turned into a lecture about practical choices and financial security and how I needed to stop living in fantasies and start thinking about real life. The breaking point came 3 weeks before graduation. I'd been accepted to Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, a program I'd dreamed about since I was 15, a program that felt like the first step toward everything I had ever wanted to do with my life. The acceptance letter felt like validation, like proof that maybe I wasn't as unrealistic and impractical as everyone kept telling me I was. But when I showed my parents the letter, their reaction wasn't celebration. It was panic. Georgetown? Mom's voice had gone sharp, the way it always did when she felt like I was slipping out of her control. Grace, honey, that's completely impractical. What are you going to do with a degree like that? Become some kind of government bureaucrat making $40,000 a year? Dad was even more direct. We're not paying for you to waste 4 years studying something that won't get you a real job. You can go to ASU like Tyler, study something practical, and live at home to save money. That's the smart choice. The smart choice? Their version of smart had nothing to do with passion, nothing to do with potential, nothing to do with the person I actually was.
It was all about staying small, staying safe, staying within the narrow boundaries of what they understood. That's when the real manipulation started. The guilt trips about how much they had sacrificed for me, the lectures about how selfish I was being, the threats about cutting off support if I didn't make the right choice. And finally, the ultimatum. Choose their version of my future or lose their support entirely. But here's what they didn't know. I'd been saving money from my part-time job at the campus bookstore for 2 years. I had scholarships, I had a plan, and I had something else. Something I'd only recently discovered about my family's history that they had kept hidden from me my entire life. My grandfather, William Smith, hadn't been just another small-town guy who worked at the post office for 40 years, like they'd always told me. 3 months before graduation, while helping clean out his attic after he passed away, I'd found a box hidden behind old Christmas decorations. Inside were military commendations, photographs of him in uniform, and letters. Dozens of letters detailing his service as an intelligence analyst during the Cold War. My grandfather had been someone important, someone whose work had mattered on a national level, someone who had dedicated his life to serving his country in ways that actually changed the world. And my parents had never told me. They'd reduced his legacy to he worked at the post office because it fit their narrative about staying small, staying ordinary, never reaching for anything that might be considered too ambitious. Finding those documents changed something fundamental in me. It wasn't just about having a family connection to the kind of work I dreamed of doing. It was about realizing that the people I'd trusted to guide me through life had been lying to me about who we were, about what was possible, about what kinds of dreams were worth pursuing. So when they announced this graduation celebration trip to Cancun, when they acted like we were one big happy family again, I knew something was off. The timing was too convenient. Their sudden generosity felt like a trap.
But I went anyway, because part of me, the part that still hoped my family could love me for who I was instead of who they wanted me to be, believed that maybe this trip would be different. Maybe they'd finally see that I wasn't trying to hurt them by choosing my own path. Maybe we could find a way to move forward that didn't require me to sacrifice my dreams. I had no idea they'd already decided that the only way to save me from my own ambitions was to teach me a lesson so harsh, so humiliating, that I'd come crawling back to them ready to accept whatever life they deemed appropriate for me. Standing in that airport terminal, watching them walk away, I realized that everything I'd feared about my family was true. They didn't love me. They loved their idea of me. They didn't want me to succeed. They wanted me to stay small enough to make them comfortable. But what they didn't realize was that in trying to break me, they were about to accidentally set me free. The Smith family vacation traditions were as predictable as Arizona sunsets and about as genuine as the artificial palm trees at the Phoenix Sky Harbor food court. Every summer, without fail, Dad would announce our destination with the enthusiasm of a weather forecaster predicting partly cloudy skies. Mom would spend weeks researching restaurants we'd never eat at and activities we'd never do because Dad always preferred to stick to the hotel pool and complain about the service. Tyler and I had learned to pack our own entertainment because family bonding time usually meant sitting in awkward silence while our parents critiqued everything from the hotel decor to the way other families interacted with their children. "Look at that," Mom would whisper, nodding toward a family laughing together at the pool. "They're making such a spectacle of themselves. Don't they realize people are trying to relax?" But this trip to Cancun felt different from the moment Dad made the announcement. For one, he'd actually smiled when he told us about it. Not his usual tight-lipped, duty-bound smile, but something that almost looked genuine. For another, Mom had immediately started talking about making memories and celebrating Grace's accomplishments, which was so far outside her normal vocabulary that Tyler and I had exchanged confused glances across the dinner table.
It'll be perfect, she said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. Just the four of us, celebrating everything you've achieved, your graduation, your bright future ahead of you. My bright future. The same bright future they'd been trying to redirect toward Arizona State and a business degree for the past 6 months. But I'd pushed down the cynicism because honestly, I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe that maybe they'd finally accepted that I wasn't Tyler, wasn't going to follow his carefully mapped out path, and that they could love me anyway. The weeks leading up to departure had been surprisingly peaceful. No more lectures about practicality, no more brochures for ASU mysteriously appearing on my desk, no more pointed comments about how some people thought they were too good for the life their parents had built for them. Instead, there were discussions about snorkeling and Mayan ruins, about room service and sunset dinners on the beach. Tyler seemed as bewildered by this sudden family harmony as I was. He asked me, "Are you buying this?" one evening as we sat in the backyard watching Dad enthusiastically research excursion packages on his laptop. "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe they finally accepted that I'm going to Georgetown no matter what they say. Or maybe they're planning something." But he had said it with the lazy skepticism of someone who'd never actually had to fight our parents the way I had. Tyler had always been the easy child, the one whose dreams aligned perfectly with their expectations. He had no idea what it felt like to be seen as a problem that needed solving. But as the departure date got closer, I'd started to relax. Mom took me shopping for new clothes, actually asking my opinion instead of just grabbing things she thought looked appropriate. Dad had even sat me down for what he called a pre-trip talk, where instead of his usual lecture about responsibility and making smart choices, he'd actually asked me about Georgetown, about what classes I was most excited to take, about what I hoped to accomplish. "I know we haven't always understood your interests," he'd said, his voice softer than I'd heard it in months. "But we want you to be happy, Grace. We want this trip to be a new beginning for all of us." A new beginning. I'd held on to those words like a lifeline, letting them override every instinct that told me something was off about their sudden change of heart. The morning of our departure, our house had buzzed with an energy I hadn't felt since I was little. Mom humming while she double-checked everyone's passports. Dad actually joking around with Tyler instead of lecturing him about his summer job performance. Even the drive to the airport had felt different, lighter somehow, like we were the Smiths off on our adventure together. And for the first time in recent memory, that felt like something to be proud of instead of something to endure.
Dad had been unusually organized, handling all our boarding passes and travel documents with military efficiency. "Stay close," he'd said as we navigated through the crowds. "We don't want anyone getting separated." Getting separated. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to the way he'd emphasized those words. Should have noticed the glance he'd exchanged with Mom when he'd said them. But I was too busy soaking up this rare experience of feeling like a valued member of my own family to analyze every interaction for hidden meanings. We'd found seats near our gate, and Mom had immediately started taking pictures. "Our last family vacation before Grace goes off to college," she'd announced, positioning us for selfies with the kind of enthusiasm I hadn't seen from her since my elementary school piano recitals. We need to document everything. Document everything. Another phrase that should have raised red flags. My mother, who usually complained about people who took too many photos, suddenly wanted to capture every moment of our time together. But I was too busy soaking up this rare experience of feeling like a valued member of my own family to analyze every interaction for hidden meanings. Tyler had been quieter than usual during the wait, scrolling through his phone with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was avoiding conversation rather than actually reading anything important. When I asked him what was wrong, he just shrugged and said he was tired from staying up too late the night before. But now, standing alone in Denver International Airport with a boarding pass for a flight I'd never take, I was starting to remember other details from that morning.
The way Dad had insisted on carrying my carry-on bag along with his own. The way Mom had kept checking her watch, despite the fact that we'd arrived at the airport with plenty of time to spare. The way Tyler had avoided making eye contact with me during our entire wait at the Phoenix Gate. They'd planned this. All of it. The sudden acceptance, the enthusiastic trip planning, the family bonding energy, it had all been performance, carefully choreographed to get me to this exact moment, to this exact feeling of betrayal and abandonment designed to break me down enough to accept whatever terms they offered for my return home. Standing there in Denver, watching other families navigate their own travel dramas, I realized that my parents hadn't just lied to me about this trip. They'd lied to me about everything. About accepting my choices, about wanting me to be happy, about loving me unconditionally. They'd spent weeks building up my hope just so they could tear it down more completely, more devastatingly than any simple argument ever could have. But what they hadn't counted on was that their carefully constructed lesson in family loyalty was about to collide with forces completely beyond their control. Forces that would turn their manipulation into the catalyst for opportunities they couldn't have imagined in their wildest dreams. Because while I was standing there processing the full scope of their betrayal, Air Force One was making an unscheduled landing just 3 gates away from where I stood. And everything I thought I knew about my family's power to control my future was about to change forever. Looking back now, I realized that my family had become masters of emotional theater long before that morning in Denver. The performance didn't start with the trip to Cancun. That was just their grand finale. The real show had been running for years, a carefully choreographed illusion designed to convince the world, and sometimes even ourselves, that we were something we absolutely were not. The Smith family brand, if you will, was built on the foundation of being reasonable people. We were the neighbors who never had screaming fights that disturbed anyone. We were the family that showed up to every school event with appropriate enthusiasm, but never embarrassed ourselves with excessive displays of emotion. We were the people other parents pointed to when they wanted to lecture their own children about gratitude and perspective. Look at the Smiths. They don't need all this drama to function as a family. What they didn't see were the invisible rules that governed every interaction in our house, rules that were never spoken aloud, but enforced with surgical precision through a complex system of sighs, meaningful glances, and strategic silence that could freeze the air in any room faster than an Arctic blast. Rule number 1, never make waves that might reflect poorly on the family's reputation. This meant that achievements were acknowledged with reserved pride, never celebration. When I won the state debate championship junior year, Mom's response was, "That's nice, honey. Just remember that some of your classmates might be feeling disappointed right now." When Tyler made Dean's List his freshman year, Dad's comment was, "Good. Now the real work begins." Rule number 2. Individual desires were always secondary to family stability, and family stability was defined as everyone staying within predetermined boundaries. Tyler's early interest in art was gently but persistently redirected towards business because creativity doesn't pay the bills. My fascination with international politics was tolerated as long as it remained a hobby, but the moment I suggested actually pursuing it as a career, it became a phase that needed to be outgrown. Rule number 3, conflict was to be handled through controlled conversation, never argument, and never in front of outsiders. This meant that every disagreement followed the same script. Someone would express concern about another family member's choices. The family member would be given an opportunity to explain themselves, and then Dad would summarize everyone's position and deliver what he called the balanced perspective that somehow always aligned perfectly with what he and Mom wanted in the first place.
The genius of this system was that it felt reasonable. We weren't a family that screamed at each other or slammed doors or threw things. We discussed our differences like civilized people. We considered everyone's feelings. We made decisions based on practical considerations rather than emotional impulses. From the outside, we probably looked like the healthiest family in suburban Phoenix. But underneath that veneer of reasonableness was something much more insidious, a complete absence of authentic emotional connection. Love in our house wasn't something you felt, it was something you demonstrated by conforming to expectations. Support wasn't about encouraging each other's dreams, it was about helping each other make smart choices that wouldn't rock the boat or challenge the status quo. I started noticing the cracks in our family's perfect facade around sophomore year of high school, when I began paying attention to how my friends' families actually interacted with each other. At Emma Rodriguez's house, her parents asked genuine questions about her interests and listened to her answers without immediately calculating how those interests might impact the family's image. At Jordan Kim's house, disagreements were loud and messy and sometimes hurt feelings, but they ended with actual resolution instead of everyone pretending the conflict had never happened. But it was visiting my friend Aaliyah Washington's family that really opened my eyes to what I was missing at home. The Washingtons argued about everything: politics, money, whose turn it was to take out the trash. But underneath all that noise was something my family had never had: the absolute certainty that they belonged to each other no matter what. Aaliyah could tell her parents she was thinking about dropping pre-med to study journalism, and instead of lecturing her about financial security, they'd spend 2 hours asking her questions about what she loved about writing and how they could help her explore that passion. "Your parents are so supportive," I'd told Aaliyah after witnessing one of these conversations. "They drive me crazy half the time," she'd laughed. "But yeah, they've got my back no matter what. Don't your parents do the same thing?" I'd mumbled something noncommittal, but the question haunted me for weeks. Did my parents have my back? Or did they just have the back of the version of me that made them comfortable? The more I paid attention, the more I realized that every interaction in our house was filtered through this unspoken question: how will this affect what other people think of us? Dad's concern about my college choices wasn't really about my future happiness. It was about what he'd tell his colleagues when they asked where his daughter was going to school. Mom's worry about my unrealistic career goals wasn't about protecting me from disappointment. It was about avoiding the embarrassment of having a daughter who couldn't find stable employment. Even Tyler, who I'd always seen as the golden child who could do no wrong, was trapped in his own version of this performance. He'd confided in me during winter break that he hated his business classes, that he spent most of his time at ASU feeling disconnected from everything he was studying. But when I'd suggested he consider switching majors to something he actually cared about, he'd looked at me like I'd suggested he drop out and join the circus. "Are you kidding? Can you imagine what they'd do if I told them I wanted to study something impractical? They'd lose their minds." "But wouldn't you rather be happy?" I'd asked. He'd rather keep the peace. And in that moment, I'd realized that Tyler wasn't the favorite son who'd escaped our family's emotional prison. He was just a different kind of prisoner, one who'd learned to find comfort in his chains. This was the environment I'd grown up in, a place where love was conditional on compliance, where support came with strings attached, and where the appearance of harmony mattered more than actual connection. A place where questioning the family narrative wasn't seen as healthy curiosity or individual growth. It was seen as betrayal of everything our parents had worked to build. So when they suddenly started acting like supportive, understanding parents in the weeks before graduation, when they began talking about celebrating my achievements and respecting my choices, I should have known it was just another performance. But I was so desperate for authentic connection with my family, so hungry for the kind of unconditional acceptance I saw in other households, that I convinced myself their change of heart was real. I told myself that maybe they'd finally realized that controlling me wasn't the same as loving me. Maybe they'd finally understood that my dreams weren't a rejection of them, but an expression of who I'd always been under all their expectations. Maybe we could finally have the kind of relationship I'd been craving my entire life. But as I stood alone in Denver International Airport, watching families reunite at baggage claim while mine flew off to Cancun without me, I understood that their recent behavior hadn't been a breakthrough in our relationship. It had been the most sophisticated manipulation they'd ever orchestrated, designed not to bring us closer together, but to tear me down so completely that I'd finally surrender to their version of who I should be. The cruel brilliance of their plan was that they'd used my own deepest desire to be truly seen and accepted by my family as the weapon to destroy my resistance to their control.
They'd given me weeks of the relationship I'd always wanted, then snatched it away in the most public, humiliating way possible to prove that their conditional love was the only kind I'd ever get. What they hadn't counted on was that their perfect plan was about to intersect with forces completely beyond their understanding or control.
But there was one person in my life who had never been part of that performance, never bought into the Smith family's carefully constructed narrative about what constituted appropriate dreams and realistic expectations. Someone who had seen through their facade of reasonableness and recognized it for what it really was: fear disguised as wisdom. My grandfather, William Smith, had been dead for 4 months by the time I found myself abandoned in Denver, but his influence on my life had never been stronger. In a family where individual expression was systematically discouraged, Grandpa Bill had been my secret ally, my proof that it was possible to be a Smith and still be authentically yourself. I'd always known that Grandpa was different from my parents, but I'd attributed that difference to generational gaps and the natural mellowing that comes with age. He asked different questions during family dinners, not about grades or future plans, but about what I was reading, what I was thinking about, what sparked my curiosity. While Mom and Dad focused on managing my behavior and directing my choices, Grandpa seemed genuinely interested in understanding how my mind worked. "Grace thinks about things the rest of us miss," he'd say when my parents would get that familiar look of exasperation during one of my passionate explanations about some international crisis I'd read about. "That's not a problem to be solved, that's a gift to be developed." But it wasn't until after his funeral, while helping clean out his belongings from the small apartment he'd moved into after Grandma died, that I discovered just how much he'd been protecting me from, and how much he'd been preparing me for. The box I'd found hidden in his closet wasn't just filled with military memorabilias, it contained a detailed record of a life I'd never known existed. A story my parents had systematically erased from our family history because it didn't fit their narrative about staying safe and small. Captain William Smith hadn't just served in the military during the Cold War. He'd been part of an elite intelligence unit that specialized in psychological operations and strategic communication. The commendations I'd found weren't just generic service awards, they were recognition for specific operations where his analysis had prevented international incidents and saved lives. There were letters from senators, from cabinet members, from people whose names I recognized from history books, all thanking him for insights that had shaped American foreign policy during some of the most critical moments of the 20th century. But more than the official documents, it was his personal journals that had truly opened my eyes to who my grandfather had been. Page after page of careful observations about global politics, detailed analysis of international relationships, and strategic thinking that demonstrated a mind operating at a level I'd never imagined. This wasn't just someone who'd happened to work in intelligence. This was someone who'd been genuinely gifted at understanding how the world worked and finding ways to make it work better. And scattered throughout those journals were references to me. Notes about conversations we'd had, observations about my questions and interests, and increasingly frequent entries expressing concern about how my parents were handling my development. "Grace thinks about things the rest of us miss," one entry from my sophomore year read. "She sees patterns that others miss, asks questions that go to the heart of complex issues, and has a natural understanding of how individual choices affect larger systems. But Mom and Dad are so afraid of anything that might disrupt their version of stability that they're systematically discouraging exactly the qualities that could make her extraordinary." Another entry from just months before his death was even more direct. "I'm worried that they're going to break something in Grace that can't be repaired. She's starting to doubt her own instincts, starting to believe that her interests are impractical rather than valuable. I need to find a way to help her understand her heritage before it's too late." His heritage. My heritage. A legacy of service and strategic thinking and making a difference in the world that my parents had buried under their obsession with conventional success and social acceptability. But Grandpa had done more than just document his concerns in private journals. He'd also taken concrete steps to ensure that I'd eventually have access to opportunities that my parents couldn't control or redirect. Tucked into the back of his journal was a letter addressed to me,
along with a business card for someone named Rebecca Martinez at the State Department's Office of Personnel Management. My dear Grace, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer here to help you navigate the challenges I know you're facing with your parents. But I want you to know that everything you're feeling, the frustration with their narrow vision, the sense that you're meant for something bigger than what they're offering, is valid and important. You come from a family of people who have served their country and changed the world, even though your parents have chosen to forget that legacy. Your instincts about international relations and global politics aren't just interests, they're callings that have been passed down through generations of Smiths who understood that some people are meant to work on problems bigger than their own immediate circumstances. I've taken the liberty of establishing some connections that might be useful to you when you're ready to pursue your real path. Rebecca Martinez is someone I worked with years ago who now helps identify and develop young talent for various government programs. I've told you, about your interests and capabilities, and she's agreed to meet with you whenever you feel ready to explore opportunities that your parents might not understand or approve of.
But more than any specific connection or opportunity, I want you to remember this. The world needs people who can see the big picture, who can understand how individual actions affect global outcomes, who can think strategically about complex problems that don't have simple solutions. You are one of those people, Grace. Don't let anyone convince you to be smaller than you were meant to be. Reading that letter in his empty apartment, surrounded by the evidence of a life much larger and more significant than I'd ever known, had been a turning point for me. It wasn't just about discovering that my family history was more interesting than my parents had led me to believe. It was about understanding that my dreams and interests weren't random rebellions against their expectations. They were expressions of something deeper, something inherited, something that connected me to a legacy of service and purpose that my parents had abandoned, but I could still claim. That's when I'd started carrying Rebecca Martinez's business card in my wallet, when I'd begun to see my acceptance to Georgetown not just as an escape from my family's limitations, but as a step toward something I was genuinely meant to do. That's when I'd started to understand that my parents' fear of my ambitions said more about their own insecurities than it did about the practicality of my dreams. And standing in Denver International Airport, feeling the full weight of their betrayal and manipulation, I realized that Grandpa had been preparing me for exactly this moment. He'd known that eventually I'd have to choose between their version of love and my own authentic path. He'd known that they would try to use emotional manipulation to keep me trapped in their narrow vision of what constituted a successful life. But he'd also given me something they couldn't take away, the knowledge that I came from people who had chosen service over safety, who had risked everything to make the world a better place, who had understood that some dreams are too important to sacrifice for other people's comfort. As I pulled out my phone to call Rebecca Martinez, my hands were shaking, not with fear, but with anticipation. Because for the first time in my life, I was about to discover what it felt like to be supported by people who understood that my ambitions weren't problems to be solved, but gifts to be developed. I had no idea that within hours, I'd be having that conversation not just over the phone, but in person, and not in some government office building, but in the most secure aircraft in the world. The deterioration hadn't happened overnight. It had been a slow, methodical erosion of everything that had once felt stable about my relationship with my family, like watching a sandcastle get claimed by the tide one grain at a time, until you suddenly realize there's nothing left where something beautiful used to stand. The first crack appeared about a week after I'd found Grandpa's hidden documents. I'd been so energized by discovering my family's real history, so excited about the possibilities that his connections might open up, that I'd made the mistake of trying to share some of that excitement with my parents.
Not the whole truth. I wasn't ready to reveal what I'd found, but just enough to test whether they might be more supportive of my Georgetown plans if they understood that my interests weren't as random as they seemed. I was thinking about Grandpa Bill the other day, and I realized I don't know much about what he actually did during his military service. Was he involved in anything interesting? The silence that followed was immediate and absolute, like someone had suddenly turned off all the sound in our dining room. Mom's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Dad's jaw tightened in that way it always did when he was about to deliver what he considered an important lesson. Tyler looked back and forth between our parents with the uncomfortable awareness of someone who'd just witnessed the beginning of something unpleasant. "Your grandfather," Dad said, finally, his voice carrying that particular tone of finality he used when he wanted to close down a conversation before it could really begin, "was a good man who served his country and then came home to live a normal, stable life. That's all anyone needs to know." But I just meant, Mom, your grandfather is gone. Dwelling on the past isn't healthy, especially when you should be focused on your own future. "I am focused on my future," I'd said, feeling that familiar frustration starting to build in my chest. "That's why I was asking. I'm trying to understand." "Understand what?" Dad had interrupted, setting down his utensils with the kind of deliberate precision that always signaled I was about to get a lecture. "That your grandfather spent his whole life doing exactly what we're encouraging you to do, making practical choices, building a stable life, focusing on what really matters instead of chasing fantasies?" Fantasies. There was that word again, the one they always used when they wanted to dismiss anything that didn't fit their narrow vision of appropriate ambition. And in that moment, I realized that they weren't just unaware of Grandpa's real accomplishments. They were actively working to bury them, to rewrite his legacy in a way that supported their own narrative about the importance of staying small and safe.
That dinner conversation set the pattern for everything that followed. Every time I tried to bring up Georgetown, they'd redirect the conversation to more realistic options. Every time I mentioned my interest in international relations, they'd launch into speeches about the importance of job security and financial stability. Every time I tried to express any kind of enthusiasm about my future plans, they'd find ways to undermine that enthusiasm with questions designed to make me doubt myself. "Have you really thought about how competitive those programs are?" Mom would ask with false concern. "What if you can't keep up with students who've had more advantages than you?" "Do you have any idea how expensive it is to live in Washington, D.C.?" Dad would add. "How are you planning to support yourself if this international relations thing doesn't work out?" The questions always sounded reasonable on the surface, the kind of practical considerations that responsible parents were supposed to help their children think through. But underneath the veneer of concern was something much more toxic. A systematic campaign to erode my confidence and make me doubt my own capabilities and instincts. They started bringing home articles about college graduates who couldn't find jobs in their fields, about young people who'd accumulated massive debt pursuing impractical degrees. They'd leave these materials casually scattered around the house, on the kitchen counter where I'd see them while eating breakfast, on my desk where I'd find them while doing homework, even tucked into books I was reading for pleasure. "I just thought this might be helpful for you to read," Mom would say whenever I discovered one of these strategically placed warnings. "It's important to have realistic expectations." But the most insidious part of their campaign wasn't the overt discouragement. It was the way they began to withdraw their emotional support in small, almost imperceptible ways. Conversations that used to flow naturally became stilted and awkward. Family activities that used to include me started happening without invitations I somehow never received. Plans for my graduation party, which had been enthusiastically discussed for months, suddenly became too complicated and maybe not necessary after all. Tyler, caught in the middle of this escalating conflict, began avoiding me altogether. Family dinners became exercises in careful conversation management, with everyone walking on eggshells around topics that might trigger another discussion about my future plans.
The easy camaraderie that had once characterized our family interactions disappeared, replaced by a tense politeness that felt more exhausting than open hostility would have been. This is what happens when someone decides their individual wants are more important than family harmony. Dad had said during one particularly uncomfortable dinner, speaking to Mom and Tyler as if I weren't sitting right there. It affects everyone, not just the person making selfish choices. Selfish choices, as if wanting to pursue my education and career goals was an act of aggression against my family rather than a normal part of growing up and becoming independent. As if my refusal to abandon my dreams was somehow a betrayal of everyone who'd ever supported me. But the worst part was how they began to reframe every positive memory we'd shared, every moment of connection we'd experienced, as evidence of their sacrifices and my ingratitude. The piano lessons they'd paid for became all that money we invested in your development that you are now wasting. The family vacations we had taken became all those experiences we gave you that you apparently didn't appreciate. Even my academic achievements became twisted into proof of their support. After everything we've done to help you succeed, this is how you repay us? So, when they suddenly shifted tactics and started acting like supportive, understanding parents again, when they started planning this celebration trip and talking about new beginnings, I should have recognized it as just another strategy in their campaign to bring me back under their control. But I'd been so worn down by months of conflict, so desperate for some return to the harmony we'd once shared, that I'd convinced myself their change of heart was genuine. I'd wanted so badly to believe that we could find a way forward together that I'd ignored every instinct telling me their sudden transformation was too convenient, too complete, too perfectly timed to be real. Now, standing alone in Denver with the full weight of their deception crushing down on me, I understood that their recent kindness hadn't been the beginning of a new chapter in our relationship. It had been the final act in a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to destroy my resistance to their control once and for all.
What they hadn't anticipated was that their perfect plan was about to encounter forces that would turn their manipulation into the greatest opportunity of my young life. The discovery came in pieces, like putting together a jigsaw puzzle where each new piece revealed how much of the picture I'd been missing all along. It started with something as simple as a phone call I wasn't supposed to overhear, escalated through a series of small inconsistencies that began to form a pattern, and culminated in the kind of revelation that changes everything you thought you knew about the people you trusted most. I was in the kitchen getting a glass of water around 10 o'clock on the Thursday night before our scheduled departure when I heard Dad's voice coming from his home office. The door was partially closed, but his tone, urgent and hushed in a way that immediately caught my attention, carried clearly down the hallway. "No, we need to make sure the timing is perfect," he was saying to whoever was on the other end. "She can't suspect anything until it's too late to change her mind about coming with us." She. There was only one person in our family who'd been having doubts about this trip. Only one person who might need to be manipulated into compliance. Me. I set down my water glass and moved closer to the hallway, my heart already starting to race with a combination of curiosity and dread. The connecting flight in Denver is crucial. That's where we'll need to make the separation look natural. Linda's already confirmed that Grace's boarding pass has the gate change notification disabled, so she won't get the update when they move our flight to the other terminal. Gate change notification disabled? My stomach dropped as the implications of what he was saying began to sink in. They weren't just planning a family vacation. They were planning something that required me to be separated from them, something that needed to look accidental rather than deliberate. "I know it seems harsh," Dad's voice continued, and I could hear him getting up from his desk chair, which meant he might come out of his office at any moment. "But sometimes you have to create a crisis to help someone understand what really matters. A few hours alone in an airport will give her time to think about what she's throwing away by being so stubborn about Georgetown." I backed away from the hallway as quietly as possible, my mind reeling as I tried to process what I just overheard. They were planning to leave me in Denver, deliberately.
as some kind of twisted lesson designed to make me more compliant, more willing to accept their version of what my future should look like. But I needed more information before I could fully understand the scope of what they were planning. Over the next 2 days, I began paying attention to details I'd previously dismissed, looking for confirmation of the horrible suspicion that was growing in my mind. Like the way Mom kept insisting on handling all of our travel documents herself, claiming she wanted to take care of all the details so Grace could just relax and enjoy the trip. I'd thought it was sweet at the time, evidence of her newfound supportiveness. Now I realized it was about control, about making sure I couldn't access information that might help me figure out their plan. Like the way Dad kept emphasizing how important it was for all of us to stay together as a family during our layover in Denver, while simultaneously making comments about how easy it is to get lost in such a big airport and how important it is to pay attention to gate changes. He was laying the groundwork for their explanation of how I'd gotten accidentally separated from them. Like the way Tyler had been avoiding eye contact with me for the past week, and how he'd started responding to my attempts at conversation with one-word answers and awkward silences. I had attributed his behavior to pre-trip stress, but now I wondered if he knew what our parents were planning and was struggling with his own guilt about being part of it. The final piece of the puzzle came on Saturday morning, less than 24 hours before our scheduled departure, when I discovered Mom on the phone in the laundry room, speaking in the same hushed, urgent tone that had alerted me to Dad's conversation earlier in the week. "She'll be fine," Mom was saying, and the defensive edge in her voice suggested that whoever she was talking to had raised concerns about their plan. "It's not like we're abandoning her permanently, just long enough for her to understand that her family is the most important thing in her life." Long enough for her to understand. The clinical calculation in her voice, the way she talked about psychologically manipulating her own daughter as if it were a medical procedure, made my hands shake with a combination of rage and heartbreak that I'd never experienced before. "Rebecca said that young people today need to experience real consequences before they'll listen to wisdom," Mom continued, and the name Rebecca hit me like a physical blow. Not Rebecca Martinez, the State Department contact my grandfather had left for me, but apparently some other Rebecca who was advising my parents on how to break down my resistance to their control.
"I know it seems extreme," Mom's voice continued, "but Dr. Rebecca Chen says that sometimes you have to create a controlled crisis to help stubborn teenagers understand that their family's love is conditional on their willingness to make smart choices. A few hours of genuine panic will help Grace appreciate everything we've done for her." Dr. Rebecca Chen. I grabbed my phone and quickly searched the name, my fingers trembling as I typed. What I found made me feel sick to my stomach. Dr. Rebecca Chen was a family therapist who specialized in what she called strategic intervention for families dealing with defiant teenagers. Her website was full of testimonials from parents who'd successfully used her methods to convince their children to abandon unrealistic career goals and make more practical life choices. One testimonial in particular caught my attention. Dr. Chen's approach helped us show our daughter that her dreams of becoming a journalist were just fantasies that were hurting our family. After experiencing real consequences for her selfish choices, she finally understood that our love and support were more valuable than any career she might pursue. She's now studying accounting at our local community college, and our relationship has never been stronger. Reading that testimonial, I felt something inside me break apart and then immediately crystallize into a kind of clarity I'd never experienced before. This wasn't just about my parents being overprotective or worried about my future. This was about them working with a professional manipulator to psychologically abuse me into abandoning my dreams and accepting their control over my life.
They weren't planning to leave me in Denver for a few hours of inconvenience and worry. They were planning a calculated psychological assault designed to break down my confidence, my independence, and my sense of self-worth until I was willing to trade my authentic dreams for their conditional approval. The most chilling part was how carefully they'd orchestrated the whole thing. The weeks of apparent support and acceptance, the enthusiastic trip planning, the family bonding activities, all of it had been designed to build up my hope and trust so that the crash would be more devastating when it came. They'd studied me like a psychological experiment, identified my deepest need for authentic family connection, and then weaponized that need against me in the cruelest way possible. They'd turned my love for them into a trap, using my own desire to belong and be accepted as the mechanism for destroying my sense of self. But as I stood in the laundry room, listening to my mother discuss the logistics of psychologically torturing her own daughter as if she were planning a dinner party, I realized that their carefully constructed plan had one fatal flaw. They underestimated me. They thought that a few hours of panic and abandonment would break me down enough to accept whatever terms they offered for reconciliation. They thought that the fear of losing their love and support would override my commitment to my own dreams and values. They thought that their manipulation would succeed because they'd convinced themselves that my dreams were just teenage rebellion rather than genuine calling. But they'd never truly understood who I was underneath all their expectations and control. They'd never recognized that my interest in international relations wasn't just a phase or a fantasy. It was an inheritance from a grandfather who'd spent his life serving something larger than his own comfort. They'd never realized that my refusal to accept their limitations wasn't selfishness. It was loyalty to the person I was meant to become. Most importantly, they never considered that their perfect plan might intersect with forces completely beyond their control or comprehension. Forces that would turn their manipulation into the catalyst for opportunities they couldn't have imagined in their wildest dreams. As I quietly backed away from the laundry room and headed upstairs to pack for what I now knew would be the most important trip of my life, I was no longer afraid of what they were planning to do to me. Instead, I was curious about what I was going to do with the freedom they were about to accidentally give me. Because while they were preparing to leave me alone in Denver as part of their twisted lesson in family loyalty, I was preparing to finally contact the people my grandfather had connected me with. People who understood the difference between dreams worth sacrificing for and dreams worth fighting for. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of pristine Arizona sunshine that made everything look possible, the kind of light that seemed to promise adventure and new beginnings. If I hadn't known what I knew about my family's true intentions, I might have actually been excited about our trip. Instead, I woke up with the strange combination of dread and anticipation that comes from knowing you're about to walk into a trap, but also knowing that you're finally ready to spring one of your own. The performance began at breakfast. Mom had made my favorite pancakes, complete with fresh strawberries and the real maple syrup she usually saved for special occasions. Dad was unusually chatty, asking about my packing and whether I'd remembered to bring comfortable shoes for all the walking we'd be doing in Cancun. Tyler even managed to make eye contact with me, though I could see the guilt written all over his face when he thought no one was looking. "I'm so excited for this trip," Mom said, reaching over to squeeze my hand with what would have seemed like genuine affection if I didn't know better. "It's going to be perfect, just the four of us, making memories that will last forever."
Memories that will last forever.
The phrase would have been touching if I hadn't known that she was actually talking about creating a traumatic experience designed to psychologically manipulate me into abandoning my dreams. But I smiled and squeezed her hand back, playing my own part in our family's elaborate theater. Me too, I said, and I meant it, though not for the reasons she thought. The drive to Phoenix Sky Harbor was filled with the kind of excited chatter that would have convinced any outside observer that we were genuinely looking forward to our family vacation. Dad pointed out landmarks and made jokes about airport food. Mom took selfies of all of us in the car, capturing what she called the beginning of our adventure. Tyler actually laughed at Dad's terrible puns, and for brief moments I could almost forget that this was all an elaborate setup for betrayal. But underneath my own performance, I was making mental notes about every detail that might be important later. The way Dad kept checking his phone for flight updates that he claimed were just routine. The way Mom kept emphasizing how important it was for all of us to stay close together in the airport so no one gets lost. The way Tyler kept fidgeting with his boarding pass as if he was nervous about something that hadn't happened yet. At the airport, their behavior became even more obviously orchestrated. Dad insisted on handling all of our check-in procedures himself, explaining that he wanted to take care of everything so we could all just relax. Mom kept taking photos of every stage of our journey, getting our boarding passes, going through security, finding our gate, as if she were documenting evidence of what a loving, thoughtful family vacation this was supposed to be. "These pictures will be so special to look back on," she said, snapping another shot of Tyler and me sitting at our gate. "Years from now, we'll remember exactly how excited we all were about this trip." Years from now, I thought, we'll remember this as the day everything changed, but probably not in the way you're expecting. The drive to Denver Sky Harbor was filled with the kind of excited chatter that would have convinced any outside observer that we were genuinely looking forward to our family vacation. Dad pointed out landmarks and made jokes about airport food. Mom took selfies of all of us in the car, capturing what she called the beginning of our adventure. Tyler actually laughed at Dad's terrible puns, and for brief moments I could almost forget that this was all an elaborate setup for betrayal. But underneath my own performance, I was making mental notes about every detail that might be important later. The way Dad kept checking his phone for flight updates that he claimed were just routine. The way Mom kept emphasizing how important it was for all of us to stay close together in the airport so no one gets lost. The way Tyler kept fidgeting with his boarding pass as if he was nervous about something that hadn't happened yet. At the airport, their behavior became even more obviously orchestrated. Dad insisted on handling all of our check-in procedures himself, explaining that he wanted to take care of everything so we could all just relax. Mom kept taking photos of every stage of our journey, getting our boarding passes, going through security, finding our gate, as if she were documenting evidence of what a loving, thoughtful family vacation this was supposed to be. "These pictures will be so special to look back on," she said, snapping another shot of Tyler and me sitting at our gate. "Years from now, we'll remember exactly how excited we all were about this trip." Years from now, I thought, we'll remember this as the day everything changed, but probably not in the way you're expecting. The flight to Denver was completely normal, which somehow made everything feel more surreal. We played travel games, shared snacks, and had the kind of easy conversation that reminded me of why I'd fallen for their recent act of family harmony in the first place. For 3 hours, we actually were the loving family they'd been pretending to be for weeks, and part of me couldn't help wondering if this was what our relationship could have been like if they'd been willing to love me for who I actually was, instead of trying to mold me into who they thought I should be. But as we began our descent into Denver, I could feel the energy shifting. Dad started checking his phone more frequently, though he tried to be subtle about it. Mom began organizing our carry-on bags with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that suggested she was preparing for something specific. Tyler got quieter, staring out the window with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Remember," Dad said as we gathered our things to deplane, "Denver is a huge airport. It's really important that we all stay together during our layover. The last thing we want is for anyone to get separated and miss our connection." the last thing we want. I almost laughed at the irony, but I just nodded and shouldered my backpack like the obedient daughter they expected me to be. Walking through Denver International Airport, I felt like I was moving through a dream sequence where everything looked normal on the surface, but carried an undercurrent of unreality that made every interaction feel significant. The gate displays showing departure information, the families reuniting at baggage claim, the business travelers rushing past with their rolling suitcases. All of it felt like the backdrop for a play I was about to perform in, though my family didn't know I'd already read the entire script. Our gate is in Consort B, Dad announced, consulting his phone with the kind of casual authority that would have fooled anyone who didn't know what he was really checking. But first, let's get something to eat. Grace, why don't you and Tyler grab a table while Mom and I get food for everyone? This was it. The moment they'd been building toward for weeks, the carefully orchestrated separation that was designed to look accidental and innocent. I could see it playing out exactly as they'd planned. They'd disappear while getting food, Tyler would suddenly remember an urgent errand that required him to leave me alone, and I'd be left sitting at a table in the food court while my family boarded their flight to Cancun without me. What they didn't know was that I'd been planning for this moment too. While they'd been strategizing about how to manipulate me into psychological submission, I'd been preparing to finally step into the life my grandfather had prepared for me. Actually, I said, pulling out my phone with the kind of casual confidence that surprised even me. I just realized I need to make a quick phone call, something about my Georgetown enrollment that I've been putting off. Why don't you guys go ahead and get food, and I'll meet you back here in 15 minutes. The look that passed between my parents was so quick that someone who wasn't watching for it might have missed it entirely. But I caught it. That split second of communication where they confirmed with each other that their plan was working even better than they'd expected. I was voluntarily separating myself from the group, making their job even easier. "Of course, honey," Mom said with what sounded like genuine warmth, but was actually satisfaction that their manipulation was proceeding so smoothly. "Take your time. We'll be right here when you get back."
We'll be right here when you get back. The lie came so easily to her that I almost admired the skill involved. She'd managed to sound caring and supportive while promising something she had absolutely no intention of delivering. "Thanks," I said, giving her the kind of grateful smile that I knew would reinforce her belief that their plan was working perfectly. "This call is really important to me." And it was important to me, though not for the reasons she thought. As I walked away from my family for what I knew would be the last time as their naive, controllable daughter, I wasn't making a call about Georgetown enrollment. I was calling Rebecca Martinez at the State Department, using the contact information my grandfather had left me for exactly this kind of moment. I was calling to tell her that I was ready to claim my inheritance. Not the financial inheritance my family thought they understood, but the legacy of service and purpose that my grandfather had prepared me to embrace. I was calling to tell her that I was finally ready to find out what opportunities were waiting for young women who understood that some dreams are too important to sacrifice for other people's comfort. What I didn't know was that within the next hour, I'd be having that conversation not just over the phone, but in person, and not in some government office building, but in the most secure aircraft in the world. The moment I dialed Rebecca Martinez's number, everything in my world shifted into a different gear. I was standing near a massive window overlooking the tarmac, watching planes taxi and take off while my family executed their carefully planned betrayal just a few hundred yards away. But instead of feeling abandoned and lost like they expected, I felt more focused and determined than I'd ever felt in my entire life. "Rebecca Martinez, Office of Personnel Management," came the crisp, professional voice after just 2 rings. "Miss Martinez, this is Grace Smith," I said, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. "You knew my grandfather, William Smith. He left me your contact information and told me to call if I ever needed guidance about opportunities in government service." There was a pause, and then her tone shifted completely, becoming warm and immediately engaged. "Grace Smith, I've been hoping to hear from you for months. Your grandfather spoke about you constantly. He was so proud of your interests and capabilities. Is everything all right? You sound like you're calling from an airport." "I'm at Denver International, and I think I'm about to be in a situation where I'll need to make some very important decisions very quickly." "What kind of situation?"
Rebecca's voice sharpened with the kind of professional alertness that told me she was taking this seriously. I took a deep breath and made a choice that would change everything. My family brought me here under false pretenses. They're planning to abandon me as part of a psychological manipulation designed to make me give up my acceptance to Georgetown and agree to stay in Arizona under their control. But I'm not going to let that happen. I'm ready to explore whatever opportunities my grandfather thought I might be suited for. There was another pause, longer this time, and I could almost hear her processing the implications of what I was telling her. Grace, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Your grandfather wasn't just proud of you, he specifically recommended you for some programs that we've been developing for young people with exceptional analytical capabilities and strong ethical foundations. Programs that could offer you opportunities far beyond anything you've probably imagined. My heart started beating faster, but not with anxiety, with anticipation. What kind of programs? The kind that your grandfather spent his career contributing to. International relations, strategic analysis, diplomatic liaison work. But Grace, I need to tell you something that might sound impossible. I'm actually here in Denver right now. You're here? I looked around the terminal as if I might suddenly spot her among the travelers rushing past. I'm part of a security detail for an unscheduled stop. The president's plane had to make an emergency landing here about an hour ago. Nothing serious, just a mechanical issue that required immediate attention. We'll be here for several more hours while the engineers complete their work. The president. I felt like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. President Harrison is here? At this airport? She is. And Grace, this might sound crazy, but would you be interested in meeting her? Your grandfather specifically mentioned that you were someone who would benefit from seeing how government service actually works at the highest levels. I've been looking for the right opportunity to make that introduction, and this situation you're describing, your family's manipulation, your need to make independent choices about your future, this might be exactly the right moment. I couldn't speak for several seconds. When I finally found my voice, it came out as barely more than a whisper. You're asking me if I want to meet the President of the United States? I'm asking if you're ready to discover what your grandfather saw in you. But I need to know right now, because if we're going to do this, it has to happen in the next few minutes. Presidential security doesn't allow for delays or changes of plan. Through the window, I could see Air Force One sitting on the tarmac, surrounded by security vehicles and personnel. The most powerful symbol of American government was less than a quarter-mile away from where I stood, and I was being offered the chance to step inside it and meet the woman who represented everything I'd ever dreamed of achieving in public service. Behind me, somewhere in this airport, my family was probably discovering that I wasn't going to return from my phone call like the obedient daughter they expected. They were probably starting to panic as they realized their carefully orchestrated plan was falling apart. In a few minutes, they'd be forced to choose between missing their flight to search for me or boarding their plane and leaving me behind as they'd always intended to do. Yes, I said, and the word came out with such certainty that it surprised even me. I'm ready. Excellent. I'm going to transfer you to Agent Thompson, who will give you specific instructions about where to go and what to expect. Grace? Yes? Your grandfather would be so proud of you right now. The line clicked, and a new voice came on. Male, businesslike, clearly someone accustomed to managing complex logistical challenges. Ms. Smith, this is Agent Thompson, Presidential Security Detail. Ms. Martinez has briefed me on your situation. Are you currently alone? Yes. My family thinks I'm making a phone call about college enrollment. Perfect. I need you to listen carefully to these instructions. Do not deviate from them in any way and do not discuss this conversation with anyone. Head to gate B47. That gate is currently closed for maintenance, but there will be a woman in a blue blazer standing near the entrance. Identify yourself to her as Grace Smith, Rebecca's appointment. She'll escort you from there. How long do you think it will take you to reach that gate? I looked around, getting my bearings in the massive terminal. Maybe 10 minutes? You have 8 minutes. If you're not there by then, this opportunity disappears permanently. Presidential security cannot accommodate delays or modifications to established protocols. I understand. One more thing, Miss Smith. Once you walk through that gate, your life is going to change in ways you can't anticipate. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want? I thought about my family, probably starting to search the food court for me with increasing desperation. I thought about their months of manipulation, their careful plan to break down my resistance and force me to accept their version of my future. I thought about my grandfather, about the legacy of service he had left me, about the opportunities he had spent years preparing me to embrace when I was finally ready to claim them. "I'm certain," I said. And the word came out with such certainty that it surprised even me. "I'm ready." "Then start walking. And Miss Smith, welcome to the real world." The line went dead, and I started moving through Denver International Airport with more purpose and clarity than I had felt in my entire 19 years of life. With each step, I was walking away from the person my family had tried to force me to be and toward the person my grandfather had always known I could become. Behind me, the Smith family's carefully constructed plan was probably starting to collapse as they realized their psychological manipulation had backfired spectacularly. Ahead of me, Air Force One waited with opportunities I'd never dared to imagine possible. I had 8 minutes to cover the distance between the daughter they'd tried to control and the woman I was finally ready to become. And for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of what would happen next. I was excited. Walking through those terminal corridors toward Gate B47, I felt like I was moving through a dream that was somehow more real than anything I had ever experienced. Every step took me further from the life my family had tried to trap me in and closer to possibilities I'd never even allowed myself to imagine. The ordinary airport sounds, rolling luggage, boarding announcements, children laughing, faded into background noise as I focused entirely on the extraordinary moment I was walking into. Gate B47 was exactly where Agent Thompson had said it would be, marked with maintenance signs and blocked off from regular passenger access. But there, just as promised, stood a woman in a navy blue blazer who looked like she could handle any situation with calm professional competence. When I approached, she didn't smile, but her eyes were kind. "Grace Smith, Rebecca's appointment," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She nodded once and spoke into a small device on her lapel. "Eagle has landed. Package is en route." Then she looked directly at me. "Miss Smith, I'm Agent Davis. From this point forward, you're under presidential security protocols. That means you follow my instructions exactly. You don't speak unless spoken to, and you understand that everything you're about to see and hear is classified at the highest levels of government security clearance. Are we clear?" "We're clear," though nothing about the situation felt clear at all. Agent Davis led me through a series of corridors I hadn't even known existed in the airport, past security checkpoints where agents nodded at her with the kind of recognition that comes from working together in high-stakes situations. With each door we passed through, I felt myself moving into a world I'd only read about in textbooks and news articles. And then we were outside, crossing the tarmac in a secure vehicle toward the most famous aircraft in the world. Air Force One sat before us like something from a movie, massive, imposing, and somehow both elegant and intimidating at the same time. The American flag painted on its side seemed to flutter even in the still air, and I had to remind myself to breathe as we approached the boarding stairs.
"Remember," Agent Davis said as we got out of the vehicle, "everything you experience here stays here unless explicitly told otherwise. The president is taking time from urgent national business to meet with you because of your grandfather's service and Rebecca Martinez's recommendation. Don't waste this opportunity." Walking up those stairs, my legs felt shaky, but my mind felt crystal clear. This was it, the moment that would define everything that came after. At the top of the stairs, another agent greeted us and led me through the most sophisticated aircraft interior I'd ever seen. Rich wood paneling, advanced communication equipment, and an atmosphere of quiet efficiency that spoke to the serious business conducted here. "Miss Smith?" A woman's voice, warm but unmistakably authoritative, came from behind me. I turned around and found myself face to face with President Sarah Harrison, the first female president of the United States, a woman whose political career I'd followed closely and admired immensely. Madam President, I managed to say, though my voice came out smaller than I intended. Please sit down, she said, gesturing to a chair across from her in what appeared to be a small conference area. Rebecca Martinez has told me extraordinary things about you and your grandfather's assessment of your potential. But before we talk about any of that, I want to hear about what brought you to call Rebecca from Denver International Airport this afternoon. So, I told her everything about my family's months of manipulation, about discovering their plan to abandon me as a psychological weapon, about finding my grandfather's hidden papers and learning about his real service to our country, about their partnership with Dr. Rebecca Chen and the calculated cruelty of using my deepest need for family connection as the mechanism for breaking down my independence. President Harrison listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious as I described the scope of my parents' betrayal. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. Grace, what you've just described isn't family disagreement or even normal parental overprotection. What you've described is systematic psychological abuse designed to destroy your sense of self-worth and independence. The fact that you were able to recognize it for what it was and choose to call Rebecca instead of submitting to their manipulation tells me that your grandfather was right about your character and capabilities. She leaned forward slightly, her tone becoming more intense. Your grandfather's work during the Cold War was crucial to maintaining international stability during some of the most dangerous moments in modern history. His ability to see patterns that others missed, to understand how individual decisions affect global outcomes, to maintain his ethical compass under extreme pressure, those weren't just job skills. Those were expressions of who he was at his core. And you believe I might have inherited some of those capabilities? I asked, hardly daring to hope that someone at this level of government might see in me what my grandfather had claimed to see. I believe you've already demonstrated them, President Harrison said with a slight smile. You uncovered your family's deception through careful observation and analysis. You refused to be manipulated, even when they used your deepest emotional needs against you. And when presented with an extraordinary opportunity, you had the courage to seize it instead of defaulting to the safe, familiar choice. She paused, studying my face with the kind of intensity that made me feel like she was seeing straight through to who I really was, underneath all my uncertainties and fears. Grace, I'm going to offer you something that very few people your age ever have the chance to consider. Our government has several programs designed to identify and develop young people with exceptional analytical capabilities and strong ethical foundations. People who might eventually serve in sensitive positions requiring both intelligence and integrity. My heart started racing, but I forced myself to stay focused on her words. These aren't just internship programs or entry-level positions. These are accelerated development tracks that could lead to significant roles in international relations, strategic planning, diplomatic service, or intelligence analysis, the kind of work your grandfather excelled at, but at levels of responsibility he never had the opportunity to reach. She leaned back slightly, giving me space to process what she was saying. But I need you to understand that accepting this path means choosing a life that most people will never understand. It means making sacrifices that your peers won't have to make. It means sometimes being separated from everything familiar while you serve purposes larger than your individual desires. I thought about my family, probably calling airport security right now to report me missing. I thought about the life they'd planned for me, small, safe, controlled, designed to keep me within boundaries they could understand and manage. I thought about the version of myself I'd been becoming under their influence, cautious, compliant, willing to sacrifice my dreams for their approval. Then I thought about my grandfather, about the legacy of service he'd left me, about the opportunities he'd spent years preparing me to embrace when I was finally ready. Madam President, I said, and this time my voice came out strong and clear. I spent 19 years trying to be the daughter my parents wanted me to be. I'd like to spend the rest of my life becoming the person my grandfather believed I could be.
President Harrison smiled, a genuine, warm expression that transformed her entire face. Then welcome to your real life, Grace. It officially begins right now. Outside the aircraft windows, I could see the ordinary world of Denver International Airport continuing its daily business, completely unaware that inside Air Force One, a 19-year-old girl from Phoenix was stepping into a future she'd never dared to imagine possible.
My family's betrayal, designed to break me down and force me back into their control, had instead become the catalyst for the greatest opportunity of my life. Their manipulation had backfired so spectacularly that they'd accidentally launched me into exactly the kind of life they'd been trying to prevent me from choosing. And the best part? They'd never even know what they'd really lost until it was far too late to get it back. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.